Final Fantasy XVI is easily the largest departure ever in a series known for switching it up. A game that retains the grandiose designs, the ideas, and incredible set pieces, but eschews large open worlds and controllable party members for a razor-sharp desire to deliver combat more akin to DMC than anything ever before, and a story focusing on one central character across 3 timelines of his life. As always with games like this, massive spoilers can appear, so there's an audio version in the Spotify and iTunes section for the podcast, and I'm going to try to be as spoiler-free as possible, be giving away a couple copies to commenters as well. Final Fantasy XVI opens with the story of 2 brothers, one the protector of the other, who's been gifted the godlike power to protect their nation and the capital. Things go wrong almost instantly. Now, even with that confession out of the way, even though things do go wrong, I can't really say that Final Fantasy doesn't take a while to really get going. It's just that when it does, boom, holy shit, moment after moment. Like sitting back, thinking that they looked up Epic and treated it as a baseline. Final Fantasy games have always had their measure of darkness with fantasy. Even the boy band antics of Final Fantasy 15 was surrounded in death and mayhem and political betrayal. In 16, you take on the mantle of an older brother, Clive, a man also outfitted with his own powers and the ability to control the skills of the icons, starting out with the Fire of the Phoenix and then gathering more and more as the story progresses, each with their own abilities to have and their specials hotkeyed to your face buttons as you play. Now make no mistake, even from the start, Final Fantasy XVI is as different as any other title in the series, and possibly even more so. First, the tone is decidedly more dark, a Game of Thrones style, though through a Final Fantasy lens. Replace the Lannisters and other brooding, bloody leaders, and instead the game focuses more on those below them, or who work for them. The warriors, the dominants, the men and women misused under the rulership of lords fighting over lands. It's also got a lot of sexual suggestions, a hot new list of cuss words to drop, and more than its fair share of diabolical in-game moments. The game does a really good job alternating between the power and duty of the warriors, the dominants, and their place in the world, as well as the normal humans in the world that they save. A lot of intermixing in the story. Everyone has this unique feeling of utility that's burned directly into the story, both literally and in a more subtle approach towards class structures of people living in a world like this and what it's like and how they're treated. The game does a tremendous service to a lot of the NPCs as well, with almost everyone having some one-liner action or notable trait, causing them to stick in your head, while a judicious use of smart planning keeps the roster of characters that you actually meet and adventure with from really being confusing. Make no mistake, Final Fantasy XVI is a central character story piece, an action movie with one main character split across those 3 time zones of his life, a sword-wielding forest fantasy gump. And action is what it has a lot of. Final Fantasy XVI wears its DMC creator's roots and DNA all over itself, drenched in it, for better or worse. 16 doesn't lean towards action, it directly falls over into a barrel of it, especially compared to the rest of the titles. And while that may not be for everyone, those who have it, like it, and will end up engaging with it will find a ton of modes and moves that replaying the game may end up being one of the better experiences in Final Fantasy for it. And that's helped by excellent control. Clive himself is controlled very smoothly with a dodge system that lets you perfectly dodge and do extra damage on return attacks, as well as a series of other types depending on the icon power that you're wielding at any one moment. Clive doesn't switch classes in the game. No one does. In fact, classes aren't really handled in any prior way that we've seen before, but instead some characters you travel with have powers that could be considered slightly a pseudo-class, but nothing that fits the prior games in form or function. What that does mean is that all the inside builds and skills and items and ideas that the prior games may have had or may not have had are certainly not here. It's all about Clive. And when it comes to battle, he has those icon skills. Now be aware that those are special skills, power skills, if you will, with the same weapon combo not really changing. That doesn't mean those icon skills don't change it up. You can put different ones that cause enemies to be pulled from their feet or grapple smaller enemies to you, fire giant fiery uppercuts with flame wings, or deflect incoming projectiles and then dive in. And you even later get power gauges for devastating combos that reward not only good players, but also at the same time, a bar for if you get hit, rewarding those players who maybe aren't so good. Juggling and cancels are also included, but not to the extent of a full action game. Still far beyond anything we've seen before in this series though. And that may be a subtle weakness or a perceived one for this game. It's not noticeable a few hours in, but as you continue to play, it slightly begins to poke at you that something's off. The game tries to toe a couple lines, tries to keep prior fans engaged with some magics and abilities that remind you of the past titles, but it also really does want that combat single-player mode. Team focus are pushed away and it's just that one character, and it can lead to a bit of a lack of focus. Luckily, you do have a lot of different icon moves you get throughout the game, and that keeps it flowing, especially at times when you just start to feel like, oh, you know what, I've outplayed this icon set, and you get another one. The great part is mixing and matching those icon sets on the fly in the combos. The game handles team-ups in a different way, obviously, due to the real-time nature with this and not the turn-based choices and attacks and group control we've seen in other games. Here, they're replaced by AI companions, joining you across most of the breadth of the story, including Torgal, your faithful dog, who can not only heal you, but just go ape shit on enemies and can even be used in combos, finishing off lead moves or keeping a combo count going as his moves add to the hits. It works very well. As you progress, you spend skill points to buy and upgrade icon powers, with many having multiple upgrade levels that you can continue even further after your first playthrough, if you so choose. Final Fantasy games wouldn't be their old selves without some equipment. Here, you've got swords, armor, rings, and pendants, and you can upgrade the weapons. So one nice thing is, while a couple are the bog standard +10 to attack, a number of them augment particular skills for the icons. Basically, they can help you out, but if you don't have the skill points to raise a level of a move, you can throw an amulet on that skill and really level up the skill itself until later on when you just want to upgrade it via the skill points. Also, the game has sets of rings that you can wear to make the game easier for those who need it. Auto-perfect dodges, auto-healing, auto-dog attacks, and more. And I can see there being some discussion around this. It's not for everyone, but, well, actually, that is a thing. It is sort of for everybody. The game is trying to be for everyone in that way, rewarding those who don't want to use those with spots for other amulets and those who need them having the option for wearing them. However, Final Fantasy does have some awkward moments. For instance, for a game pushing combat and real-time action, almost DMC-like scenarios for the fighting engine, it loves to take your control away from you. And strangely enough, it can feel like it's doing it at the worst times, especially in the massive battle scenes. The game's focus on these epic proportional battles looks great. Giant kaiju looking spiritual avatars blasting castles down around each other's ears looks cinematic. But the movesets are pretty basic, and during these scenes, the game loves to take control during the battles, which pays in dividends for feeling cinematic and epic, but it also hurts it by removing the personal touch actual combat in those sections would deliver. It's there, it's just that many times the game will remove it to show you 5 or 6 moves, and then you press a button or you sort of hold for a power attack. They get better as the game continues, but I actually consider this sort of a lost opportunity for delivery of the gameplay itself. And speaking of that, let's just sort of look at the differences. One main character, no real classes, focus on DMC style combat and equipment, adjusting that combat, hyper mature content compared to the previous games, and a grimdark style story that leaves a good deal of the open, goofy fantasy of the prior games in its rear view as it sprints off to fire sword uppercut its next enemy and changes world exploration. While not all games in the series have been open world, most have rewarded exploration with some sizable territories for you to go ahead and cause enemies to gnash their teeth every time you showed up. It's important to remember that Final Fantasy XVI isn't open world, and while the locations, many of them are lush, in fact fascinatingly so, with incredible moments from rocky crags jutting in the sky around you to these awesome forested areas that look like they're pulled directly from a photography book. Even the largest, though, explorable areas are actually pretty small, and those that aren't are very linear, with very little off-the-path exploring that you can do, meaning most locations' battles are pretty much exactly the same on your first playthrough, without a lot of exploring. Some parts do have it, but it's not the majority, evening out in the later bits, but still nothing compared to prior games. And in many ways, the DMC-style routes show themselves here, with most of the paths all going to the same place, and really not there that many of them. And fights bookended by either specific locations you can mark a battle to come to, or a cutscene to get you into one. For those who want to get their battle on in the Arena Crystal hideout area, you can do that, but that just goes to show you sort of the focus change that we see here. And you may have noticed something. I didn't talk too much about the side quests, and the reason for this is that many times the side quests are actually connected to the main quest itself, even though they're sort of called side quests. They're not always solely separate, and those that are not that great. They really just pale in comparison to the main story and drive home the oftentimes joked about dichotomy between some godlike main protagonist carrying eggs for a random woman to pay off her new blankets leasing plan. To play this game, you really have to go into it and realize just how much of a change this is. Final Fantasy in that way is a bit like a religion that you see in century gaps, changing each time. But Final Fantasy XVI feels like a leap of a couple hundred years, at times familiar, and at other times definably different and almost obscure. But one thing you'll never hear from me is getting mad at a company that decides they want to do something different. Final Fantasy always has. It's just that this one's, well, much larger of a change than others. What isn't, though, is the game's looks, which are notoriously almost always good. Though not with the wide-open presentation of, say, the Horizon games or that lush, windswept spot and stark beauty of Ghost of Tsushima, but instead in their own contained environments and the organic feeling to each one, matching in some places or exceeding The Last of Us 2. But this time, during the massive battles with hundreds of spell effects popping up. It's impressive, but in a different way, from the forested walks through glens that look almost perfect in presentation, or the first giant battle you have between two Goliaths that show what shattering through the air, smashing down castle walls and blasting forests could look like in a fantasy game. The PS5 also makes a mockery of the loading times between locations. Now, it is not seamless. It does lower the loading time in locations to something that's in the sub 1 to 2 second, which is very good when you're popping around the map, going back to places to battle or explore, or just loading in a new spot. Motion blur will have an option to be patched out later, but it isn't here now, and this is after a patch popped up, which I'm going to talk about in a second. Character design graphically is awesome, especially the middle-aged versions of the character that do away with the mode over details that childhood models have, and actually looks incredible. Color work, texture work, environmental details, and weather are all very good. There are two options for the graphics. There's your quality and your performance, and a patch dropped 2 days prior to the release of this, so hopefully that's some kind of prelim to the patch the developers said that they were going to release for performance. With quality mode, you're still looking at 30 FPS, and sadly, no way to turn off motion blur even with this new patch that I got. It looks awesome most of the time. And then the performance mode, which is up to 60, but it does go up and down even with this patch installed. Its performance could be better, but it never gets in the way of enjoying the game, and it certainly didn't impact the combat. Final Fantasy, despite some issues here and there, is a phenomenal looking game. And the presentation is also backed up by tremendous audio from the voice actors. With one or two questionable choices, the majority of Final Fantasy XVI's voiceovers are awesome, even from some random voice actress playing a bar winch propositioning a man outside a rustic inn in the hopes of a quick lay, to the main leads and their henchmen, many of who sound like they actually gargled glass and rocks before going into the recording booth. Voice work is excellently highlighted by a talented lead that has to take the majority of the emotional story beats on their own shoulders, many times racing to some epic moment that doesn't seem like it would have a normal theme to it that a normal person could actually emote through. But he does it and grounds it perfectly. Also grounded perfectly is the music. It's pretty much a triumph, in a different way than the prior games though, because mostly the consistent battle music ends up being the majority of what you actually hear. The larger orchestral themes do carry a number of components from prior games, large instrumental set pieces, thematically hammering out in heroic moments, and then some slower ones filled with despair, many times in the same track due to the way the story's delivered. Final Fantasy has always gravitated towards orchestras and full-throated tracks, and while there are a couple here, there's some that are more lean and wispy, letting a single instrument or at least one type shine. For the most part, it is expected stuff, but those expectations are high for Final Fantasy, and it meets them. What also meets that level is the sound work. It's pretty much the same we've expected from these guys. Clear sounds for the actors, fighting, weapons, magic effects, and environmental moments also, like raids, rain, explosions, fire, wind, earthquakes, and whatever other horrible world event you can possibly imagine. It's good, clean audio for the most part. This brings us to the fun factor and how everything is put together. The directors of the game have never really hidden what they want with this, and that's an action title that anyone can play. Anyone can play. And that is what they delivered, an over-the-top action game. Excellent monster designs with a good hold on rewarding skilled players with insane combos and over-the-top magic. That's awesome. Different? Yes, undeniably so, but still awesome. However, where Final Fantasy may end up paying off is, strangely enough, for many gamers on the second or third playthrough. Let me explain that. When you beat the game, you choose a Game Plus mode, and if you want, you can choose a new game mode called Final Fantasy mode, where you keep your skills and attributes, but the enemies not only get stronger, it also changes positionings and sometimes even drops multiple enemies where there were none, or where changing up the entire feeling of the game occurs. Mixing enemies that never normally appeared together is a perfect challenge for those people who want it. You can also now merge items that you get on the second playthrough with the same item that you had on the first playthrough, changing that as well. In many ways, Final Fantasy XV was a group adventure game with action prominent, but always still centering somewhat on a team and its dynamic and the adventures within. Final Fantasy XVI is an action game, single character story piece that no matter how big it gets, it is still about a central character and their growth as a person. And that brings me to my rating. Honestly, a pleasant surprise, as well as almost frustratingly so, a different surprise. 16 is noticeably a different game. The shift's dramatic, and I think the reception will be as well. The consistent back and forth of the mystery of the dominance and the people around them, friends and enemies. The game really is hugely different, and I like that story. And I can see it causing a ton of concern when people play it and don't really get a lot of the feels they may have got from the prior games. And it doesn't have the exploratory nature of the prior couple games. And its more mature story delivery takes a little while to sort of hammer home. I enjoyed the game, has its issues, and it's not my favorite Final Fantasy game by a long shot, but it's a unique entry into a series and is a ballsy switch up. What I came away with from the first playthrough is that Final Fantasy 16 offers this different experience between the first and second playthroughs, and that's going to entice a lot of people. That action mode when they jump in is something that they can really dive into if they like the combat, where if somebody doesn't, they can experience the story and the action the first time and then pretty much put it away. I liked a lot of Final Fantasy 16, but it is not without its issues that did detract from some of my enjoyment. I still rate this game a buy, but be aware of just how unique, well, everything is in it. So anyway, that's it for me. I hope you guys liked the review. If you did, give it a thumbs up. If you didn't, give it a thumbs down. Check out the Patreon. Thanks to Square for the code, early code as well, which was awesome. Peace out and enjoy the rest of your week.
Reform the cohorts.
At once.
There. Clive doesn't have your nose, I said. He'd stumble off a cliff, I said.
Well, that's the trouble with a nose like mine. Can't help sticking it where it's not wanted.